Welcome back to TACTCast, a production of the Tennessee Academy of Christian Thought.
Hey, man, how you doing?
Hey, pretty good, Phil.
Oh, it's good to come back again.
Yeah.
I know we finished off our last discussion on Daniel.
Daniel, right?
And we talked about the secret gospel of Mark. That's what we're looking at today.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the secret
So
gospel.
we have Stephen Carlson's The Gospel Hoax, Morton Smith's invention of Secret Mark.
Yep.
So I thought Mark Goodacres, the associate professor of New Testament at Duke, in their Department of Religion, thought he had a really good little synopsis of this. So, combining the sharp eye of a master sleuth and the erudition of an academic, Stephen Carlson tells the story of an extraordinary literary hoax. With forensic skill, Carlson shows how Morton Smith succeeded in fooling many biblical scholars into believing that he had discovered a hitherto unknown fragment of a sensational early Christian gospel. The gospel hoax uncovers the clues and unmasks the perpetrator of a remarkable feat of deception. Fascinating, compelling, and utterly convincing. Okay, so who's Stephen Carlson?
Well, Stephen Carlson is, so I think at the time he wrote this book, he hadn't finished his PhD in New Testament studies, but he does now have it, and he is an associate professor in Australia somewhere. I can't remember. But he works on early patristics, New Testament. He has fairly recently, come out with a multi-volume collection of the fragments of Papias or Hierapolis. So that's kind of exciting, and maybe we'll get to that because I'm set to go through the introduction soon. So hopefully we'll
Awesome.
Talk about that on one of these episodes.
Okay. So, well, I mean, what do you got?
Well, so what's going on here is Carlson's looking at a text that's known as the Secret Gospel of Mark, or Secret Mark. And this text was discovered in 1958 by Morton Smith, who was then, he's deceased now, but was then a very well-known and respected, albeit perhaps not always liked, expert in the New Testament and patristic writings, and he was a professor at Columbia. And so when Morton Smith went to, I think it was 1957, he went to the Mar Saba Monastery, which is in Palestine, the West Bank today, in their library, and looking through that, he discovered in the back of a 17th century book a handwritten copy of a letter purporting to be from Clement of Alexandria. Now, he was a church father who died in 215. So it was from Clement of Alexandria to a certain Theodore, otherwise unknown, right?
Okay.
And Clement is in this letter writing to this Theodore and saying, hey, you're doing a good work fighting against this sect of the Carpocratians who had some weird sexual practices, and he says to this Theodore, you asked about this gospel from Mark, in which that described Jesus having a meeting with a young man wearing linen. Nowhere did it wearing just a linen sort of tunic, and naked underneath. And Clement tells this Theodore in the letter that nowhere does it say naked man lay with naked man. Instead, it says, and he quotes at length the passage from Secret Mark that said that the young man wore only a linen tunic, and he went naked and talked to Jesus. Or not naked, he was naked underneath with this tunic, and he went and talked to Jesus and spent the night with him learning the mysteries of the gospel, or something along those lines. Okay. And so that came out in 1958. Morton Smith found the document and published it, actually, he sent pictures of it. He left the document in the library, but he took photos of it, and so he let the photos be shown. Now, since then, the document has disappeared. Can't be found anywhere. So all we have are the photos of this letter of Clement of Alexandria writing to this certain Theodore, in which he quotes at length secret mark. So we don't actually have a gospel secret mark. We have a lengthy quotation in a letter from Clement to Theodore.
Okay.
So that's what we have. And he found this in the back of a 17th century book in the Marsaba Library. Now you can see why that, would cause some scandal. Here we have this heretofore unknown account of Jesus in his practices, So, and Carlson is now pretty early on. There were some people were saying this is fishy. The elements of this Clement document, it's called Theodore, right? The letter to Theodore is in which the passage of secret mark is contained. This is fishy, but so scholarly opinion was kind of divided. I mean, some people accepted it. This is a legitimate gospel, just like all the others. And in fact, I know at least one doctoral dissertation has been written based upon secret mark. So Carlson is arguing in his book that it's a hoax, and furthermore, he argues that it was a hoax perpetrated by Morton Smith himself. And so, several people like you quoted Mark Goodacre, the late Larry Hurtado. They were both convinced that Carlson's argument was pretty sound. So, so he's brought significant doubt into the authenticity of secret mark.
So mostly this is about a text that's found purportedly from Mark.
Right.
We only have a fragment of it in a letter from Clement.
Right.
And it talks about Jesus in linen and a guy in linen and naked underneath.
Right. And he studied with Jesus the secrets or the mysteries of the gospel that night. I think that's what it says, mysteries of the gospel, yeah.
Okay.
So, it implies all kinds of things, right?
Sure.
So
it's kind of like at the height of Gnosticism too, right?
Yeah. And so, if what people would say is if there is this gospel that existed at one time, doesn't anymore, there's probably tons of gospels, right? Beyond just the 4 canonical gospels.
Yeah.
And there are other gospels.
Supposedly we have lots of
those that have survived. There's several.
Mary Magdalene.
Right. But they've all have a later dating than the canonical gospels.
Right.
I mean, maybe that's an issue for another time, but
sure.
They're regarded to be much later, significantly later. But secret mark would indicate, there's a whole nother stream of tradition about Jesus and his practices.
Yeah.
That seems to be quite different than the canonical structures, and so brought in all sorts of questions, the origins of Christianity, this sort of stuff. So.
Yeah. So it seems to be. So from my perspective, given that this is something that just happens to pop up in the 1950s,
right?
We have no other reference to secret mark,
right?
And it's in a letter from the 200s, or maybe
late
100s.
You're right.
And it seems to pop up around some of the same time that some of these other, pseudepigraphal works pop up. So I'm curious to see what Carlson's argument is on forgery, because I would just in my understanding, I would lean towards forgery, just in that we have one document that.
Well, so I think in this sense, what he's referring to is so you can have,
I guess there's a difference between forgery and pseudepigraphal work.
Yeah, you can have a work that is a gospel, so the Gospel of Peter or whatever, that is a gospel account that's later, and that claims to be written by Peter. But what Carlson is arguing, this is a modern forgery.
Yes.
With other intentions, and so he marshals quite a bit of evidence. I think to me maybe one of the most convincing. Well, I mean, taken together, I think is probably the best way to look at this. Taken together, it's a pretty convincing argument. So first of all, it is odd that the document goes missing, right, after Mark discovers it. It is also odd that none of the indexes of the contents of the Library of Marsaba prior to Morton Smith being there lists this book, right? So that's odd that it just appears. Although, Marsaba is not like a modern library. Stuff is just stuffed in drawers.
Yeah.
Plus, from the photographs that we have of the document, which isn't much, the book itself, the ends of the pages, look like they sat on a shelf and were exposed to sun because they've discolored. But that's not Marsaba. The library there is closed. There are no windows. It's not like books on shelves in a library you might see today. Like my personal library at work, I'm always concerned that the sun doesn't shine on the books because I don't want to fade them because I have this weird.
You won't put any notes in your books. Or
no, I don't
anything.
write in books. I can't do that. It's somehow sacrilegious. So I'm very careful. But in Marsaba, you wouldn't have to worry about that because there are no windows, right? So that's kind of odd. Another thing, it seems like that the ink, if I remember right, the ink. So if the document appears to have been copied by a monk at Marsaba in the 17th century, because the book it is in is 17th century, right?
Yes.
And so seemingly what would have happened is a monk in the library or somebody at that time, 17th century, found this letter, right, and another document, and they copied it in the back of this book, and the original letter's gone, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the ink that this was copied in should have been a 17th century ink, right?
Right.
With 17th century ink would scorch the pages and bleed through. This does not. So that's a bit. Of course, we can't analyze the ink because the book has gone missing, and all we have are these photographs. But they didn't scorch and run through like they would if they were 17th century. You have.
So this is like where Goodacre says the forensic investigation here. Yeah.
I think so. So the other thing is Carlson argues that there's evidence of what's known as a forger's tremor. Because if you're forging a document, here's a little lesson for all you future forgers out there. If you're forging a document, you don't. A forger doesn't actually write; they copy, right? They draw basically, and as they try to slowly copy the writing style of the original, there are sort of it goes in fits and starts.
Yes.
And wherever you sort of, and so that's not a smooth line. That's kind of a line that shows a tremor, right? It looks like the line's not exactly straight.
So, telling a little bit about myself here. But back when I used to forge my mom's signature on things in school.
Was this last week? Oh, okay.
So no. Back in like middle school, high school.
Yeah.
Permission slips.
Oh yeah, I got you. Okay. Not checks.
No.
Okay, good.
So, did I have my debit cards? I'm not that old. Who has checks anymore?
Yeah, I had a daughter that didn't even have checks. Yeah, what's a check?
So, when I was practicing my mom's signature back then, I noticed I had those sort of
forger's tremor.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I practiced just writing her signature to the point that I could do it almost effortlessly.
Okay, so here's the thing. That's a signature, same thing over and over again.
Yes.
But if you're writing out a letter, right, you'd have to copy it. I don't know, the whole thing hundreds of times. I don't know how many times you have to copy it so that you could then write it naturally.
Yep.
So the only other possibility is that the monk had a tremor, maybe, right? But there are other elements too. So like there are weird pen lifts. So like somebody's going slowly, and then they gotta sort of reconfigure things. They lift the pen a little bit, and when they put it back down, there's a blob of ink.
Yes.
Right? Or where you're gonna stop because you gotta feel, okay, now how do I form this letter the rest of the way? You stop, and there's a blob there. and then you move on. So these are the sorts of things that Carlson goes through to show that this is...
And so it's that in conjunction with all the other issues that it just kind of makes sense. It all fits together. This seems to be, at least like forensically, this doesn't make sense for the time
so
period that
and another example, sort of another forensic example is the letters aren't always made the same. So the letter tau sometimes is made one way, sometimes another way. Lam does the same way, which is not typical of somebody. We typically write letters the same, individual letters the same way. Right. So this is somebody, who's not writing consistently as the original author would. So it's pretty interesting. I mean, another bit of evidence he marshals is so everybody has their own personal vocabulary, right? Yeah. When you speak and when you write, you say words more common than certain words more common than I do, and vice versa. And when you write, it's the same way. And so if you you use those commonly, and those are known, and they were published in a sort of 4-volume work that had just come out that we know Morton Smith possessed. But you would occasionally in everything you wrote, you would use a word that you had never used before, right? Those are known as hapax legomena, right? So this is a word that you have only used one time in all your writings, right?
Okay.
And so though there are too few of those for what you'd expect in this length of a document. So theoretically, Clement would have used, so many words that he'd never used before in writing this, extensive letter to Theodore.
Okay.
If he were just writing this naturally. This has very few of those, which indicates somebody who's trying to copy the vocabulary of Clement, right? Does that make sense? So, so if you're going to write like me, you would read everything I'd written, and if you had a book of all of my vocabulary I've ever used, right, then you would try to use those vocabulary. So that
it wouldn't go outside of your vocabulary.
Right, and this seems to be what the author of this Theodore letter from Clement did, right? Another thing is, unless
he knew that what am I trying to say? He could know what you just explained to me and then do the opposite.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, you could. But you could do that. But I
didn't know that, so I would have stayed within your
vocabulary. Right, and also it goes to the scriptures that Theodore, this purported letter, uses are all pretty much scriptures that Clement had quoted elsewhere. So there's nothing out of the ordinary there, except that when Clement quoted scripture elsewhere, usually very free-flowing quotations. It's not word for word. These happen to be word for word, more so than what Clement would normally do. So it's kind of an odd thing.
So not his typical writing style.
Yeah, exactly. So the style is different. You have the sort of forger's tremor and these other sort of physical things. You have the ink not seeming not to be 17th century ink. You have, but we can't know because we can't examine the actual physical copy. There's also the fact that the 17th century book that this appeared in was very easy to get on the American market in the 1950s, and it wasn't terribly expensive. It's kind of odd that it would appear, because if I remember, as a Latin book, and it's odd that it would appear in Marsaba, but it was common in America. It's also very small, like 6 by 7.5 inches, which means you could carry it into the monastery easily, so easy to introduce. So all these things indicate that Secret Mark is a forgery.
Okay, so I'm thoroughly convinced that it's a forgery. So what's the opposite side? What's the argument that it's legit?
Well, so mostly, Biblical Archaeology Review, gosh, I don't know, 20 some years ago, did a they took the text and gave it to two separate forensic experts who study handwriting, forensic handwriting experts. And one of them said authentic, one of them said not authentic. So it's difficult. You know, it's not.
So I'd like
maybe
to
it's
hear
not a slam dunk.
I would like to hear the reasoning that the one who said it's authentic. I would love to hear his reasoning behind it.
I don't know. I just sort of. I didn't even skim the article. I just saw the sort of the results.
Yes.
There's also, but it seems to me that most opposition to it, opposition to Carlson's Gospel Hoax book, is directed at his accusation that Morton Smith himself was a forger. So,
so they accept it. Basically, the document's a forgery, but maybe not specifically Morton
I don't
Smith?
know. I don't know that they necessarily openly accepted it was a forgery. But in my brief survey of sort of reviews of this book, that seems to have been the number one complaint. So Carlson argues that that the text itself actually have. I'm trying to find it here in my notes. That the text itself actually has a Easter egg in it, to use the lingo of the Utes of today. So, would you like to explain what an Easter egg is?
Oh yeah, so the Easter egg,
like in big gaming, right?
Yeah,
it's
so
a
like
gaming
in
thing.
gaming, an Easter egg is where you're in one game and you might have like a reference to another game. So you're playing through and you find like this little secret passageway and you get to this part where you get like this cool reference to another game. And it's like a little Easter egg that the developers put in that it's not really... It's something that it's cool if you find it, but it doesn't really affect anything if you don't.
So the number one here is that in the Theodore letter, he quotes Jesus, or refers to Jesus talking about salt losing its flavor. Mm-hmm. Okay, right? That's a famous gospel quote from the canonical Gospels. However, the way it is stated sounds like it's losing its flavor by mixing with other things, as if the salt were granulated. Okay, as we think of salt being granulated, and you're mixing other granules in with it. Okay. The thing is, that was not that salt was not granulated like that until the 19th century. I think it was 19th or 20th century, but I think it was 19th century, and it was done by the Morton Salt Company in the United States, right?
So when we said Morton Smith, I swear I was going to say something at the beginning, like, isn't there a salt?
There is.
It's Morton Smith or Morton Salt or something like that.
So Carlson thinks this is an Easter egg where Morton Smith is alluding to himself as being the author. Now that has been criticized because I haven't read this in detail.
Yeah.
But it seems like in the ancient world there were some forms of powdered salt. So not granulated the way we know because the Morton Smith Salt Company did that. There's another thing, and that was in Smith's writings about this. He attributed the Theodore document to a certain M. Madiotes. And honestly, I'm not sure exactly. I can't remember how he came to that conclusion. But Madiotes is a very unusual name, and it means loose hair or bald, and it can also mean to swindle. And Morton Smith was bald. And so,
and apparently swindling.
Exactly. So Carlson, argues that this is Morton Smith referring to. So then Carlson, who actually before he started New Testament studies, he was an attorney, and he has a jurisprudence doctorate. And so then he starts going, and this is, I think, where he's the weakest, but it is interesting to think about. He goes into motives. So so Morton Smith had. So what are the motives? He didn't make any money off of this.
I was going to say, what did he gain?
Why
other
would
than
Morton
like
Smith do this?
the scholarly, the prestige that
Yeah.
comes along with finding something like that?
Yeah, so that's part of it, and also Morton Smith was rejected from Harvard in 1950. He didn't get tenure at Harvard in 1955, and so Carlson speculates that this was a way for him to put one over on the academic community that rejected him. Now, just before this came out, 58, I think it was 57, somewhere in there, he got a job at Columbia, and he ended up getting full professor at Columbia. So he actually succeeded in the academic world. But Carlson argues this could be a way to just say, hey, you guys rejected me, but I'm smarter than you because I fooled you. There's also the element, there's kind of the implication that there may have been some homosexual activity between Jesus and his followers, right?
I think that's the one time I've ever heard a reference to Secret Mark had to do with that sort of narrative of homosexual
Right.
dealings between Jesus and somebody else.
Right. And Morton Smith was himself a homosexual. Now it's probably not so direct, right? If Morton Smith is the forger. But Morton Smith does seem to, by people that knew him, did seem to really enjoy. He himself was an atheist, and he seemed to enjoy aggravating, prodding, poking believers. And this could have just been a way for him to just, be more of an agitator. So to me, that's, as far as I can tell, that's where most of the criticism of the work comes from. And, the fact that, Carlson says that Morton Smith is the forger, that doesn't really matter to me. It does seem that, the forger's trim and all this other information seems to me it's,
it
fairly clear it's a forgery. At the very least, you really couldn't use it for any serious academic study, right?
Right.
But I suspect it's a forgery. And like I said, Larry Hurtado was convinced, Mark Goodacre, and they're not alone. So, so I tend to think, probably a forgery. But it's certainly, because it's so suspicious, it really shouldn't have any weight in any academic discussions about the historical Jesus or the early Christian communities, I think.
Yeah.
So it was it was kind of a fun read. So
sounds like an interesting read.
Yeah.
So what are we doing next?
Well, I think we finally need to next time get to the Capes book on Yahweh texts in Paul's writings. That's really dense. So I've been kind of putting it off, but I think maybe we should handle that next.
Let's do it.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody.
Yep.
Till next time.
Thank you for watching TACTCast, a production of the Tennessee Academy of Christian Thought. Be sure to subscribe, like, and comment. Make sure to follow us over on our social medias. Links in the description. Thanks for watching.